Book 4, Chapter 6 of A Woman of Genius by Mary Hunter Austin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Book 4, Chapter 6. It is a great mistake to suppose that assertiveness is the only mannish trait taken on by successful women, nor is pliability the only feminine mark they lose. By what insensible degrees it came about I do not know, but I found myself on the peak of popularity, very much of the male propensity to be beguiled. I was willing to be played upon, and so it was skilfully done, to concede to it more than the situation had a right to claim for itself. I pulled myself up afterward, or was pulled up by the sharp rein of destiny, but for the time while my success was new, I was aware not only of the possibility of my being handled, but of my luxuriating in it, of demanding it as the price of my favor, and in particular of valuing Palatkin for the way in which, by my own moods, my drops and exaltations, he brought me to his hand. How much of the fact of my private life he was really acquainted with I never knew, but he understood enough of its reaction to make even my resistances serve to push me on to the assured position of a theatre and a clientele of my own. It stood out for me as he described it, not so much as a means of dividing me from my beloved, but as a new and completer way of loving. I wanted more ways for that, space and opportunity. I wished to lay my gift down, a royal carpet for Helmeth Garrett to walk on. I would have done anything for him with it except surrender it. Not the least thing that came of my condition was the extraordinary fluorescence of my art. Every night as I drew its rich and shining fabric about me, I was aware of all forms and passions, the mere masquerade of our delight in one another. Every night I embroidered it anew. I adored and caressed him with my skill. Palatkin went about wringing his hands over it. "You are a wonder, and you are wasting it on them swine." That was his opinion of my support. "And to think you could have a theatre of your own, and what you like." A theatre like me? Me spread over it, expressed, exemplified, carried out to the least detail? "You shall have it even in the box office," he responded magnificently. "How soon?" "I will bring the plans this afternoon. I got 'em ready in case you came around." But he was much too intelligent to undertake to bind me to them at that juncture. Things went on like this until the last week in November. Then I had a telegram from Helmeth saying that he would be detained still longer. Every pulse of me had been so set to his coming on the 27th that I thought I should not be able to go on after that. I should go out like a light when the current is stopped. I had so little of him, not even a photograph, nothing but my ring and a few trinkets he had bought me in Italy. If I could have had a garment he had worn, a chair in which he had sat. I went round and looked at the Astor House, because he told me that he had stopped there once, years ago. I stood that for 3 days, and then I went down to New Rochelle, where he had written me earlier his girls were at school. Not on my own account, you understand, but as a possible patron of the school on behalf of my niece, who was, if the truth must be told, less than 2 years old. While I was being shown about, I had Helmeth's children pointed out to me. They looked, as I had surmised, like their mother. If they had in the least resembled their father, I should have snatched them to me. Everything might have turned out quite differently. They were, the principal said, nice girls and studious, but they did not look in the least like their father. It was one of those dark, gusty days that come at the end of November, damp without rain, and of a penetrating cold. There had been a great storm at sea lately, and you could hear the wash of its disturbances all along the Sound. There was no steady wind, but now and then the damp air gave a flap like an idle wing. It was like the stir in me of a formless, cold desire, not equal to the demand life was about to make on it. As I turned into the station road after a formal inspection of the premises, I met the girls coming back from their afternoon walk with the teachers, 2 and 2. The Garrett girls were next to the last. They were very near of an age. I waited, half hidden by a tree, to watch them as they passed. They were well covered up from the weather in large blue coats with capes, and blue felt hats with butterfly bows to match at the ends of their flaxen braids. They looked like their mother. I couldn't see them growing up to anything that would fit with Sarah and Jerry and Polatkin. The wing of the wind shook out some gathered drops of moisture as they passed. The branches of the trees clashed softly together, and as they turned into the grounds, I noticed that the older one had something in her walk that reminded me of her father. I was pierced through with a formless jealousy of the woman who had borne them in her body. I was moved, but not with the impulse to draw them to my bosom. I felt back in the place where my boy had been for the connecting link of motherliness, and failed to find it. I had had it once, that knowledge of what is good to be done for small children, and the wish to do it. But it was gone from me. It was though I might have had a hand or a claw, any prehensile organ by which such things are apprehended, and when I reached it out after Helmeth's children, it was withered. What I found in myself was the familiar attitude of the stage. I could have acted what swept through me then. I could have brought you to tears by it, but there was nothing I could do about it but act. I wrote Helmeth that night that I had seen the children, and then I burned the letter. He came at last. He was greatly concerned about his enterprise, which was not yet established on that footing which he would like to have for it, and I think it was a relief to him to have me without the conventions and readjustments of marriage. It was tacitly understood between us that things were better as they were until that business was settled. I think he could not have had a great deal of money at the time. All that racing to and fro between London and Mexico must have cost something. His anxiety about the girls, which occasioned his sending them to the most expensive schools, and his affection for them, which led to their being carted about by their aunt to meet him occasionally at far-called places, was an additional drain. We were very happy. There is nothing whatever to tell about it. We met in brief intervals snatched from our work, and did as other lovers do. Sometimes he would come for me at the theatre. The freshness of my acting never palled on him. Other times I would find him waiting for me in the little flat I had expressly chosen and furnished to be loved in. The pricking warmth of his presence would meet me as I came up the stair. Not long ago I found myself unexpectedly in a part of the city where we used to walk, because we were certain not to meet any of our friends there. There was a tiny café where we used often to dine, and the memory of it swept over me terrifyingly fresh and strong. With all this, it was plain that we got on best when we were most alone. It was not that I did not every way like and was interested in the friends he introduced to me, outdoor men, most of them, and their large-minded, capable wives. I got on with them tremendously, and found them as good for me as green food in the spring, sated as I was on the combined product of professionalism and temperament. It was chiefly that the simplicity and openness of their lives brought out for him the duplicity that lay at the bottom of ours. For it was plain that they wouldn't have understood, wouldn't have thought it necessary. They could have faced, those women, strange lands and untoward happenings, had many of them faced sterner things for the sake of their husbands, with the same courage and selflessness with which they would in my circumstances have faced renunciation. It was the realization of this, so much sharper in him who had seen and known, that checked and harassed Helmeth. He wished to be at one with them, to be felicitated on my success and my charm, to include me, if only by implication, in that community of adventure with which these mining and engineering folk had ringed the earth. and the necessity of holding our relation down to the outward forms of friendship established on the supposition of our having grown up together, fretted him. "It isn't honest," he broke out once after he had tried to persuade me to let him tell his friends that we were engaged. "It's all right between us. You are my wife in the sight of whatever gods there are, but that isn't what other people would call you." "Somehow, Helmuth, so long as it is with you, I don't care much what they call me." "Well, I care. I care a lot. You don't seem to remember you are going to be my girl's mother. Sons, too, I hope. We ought to have some more children. Sanderson's got 4. Sanderson had been our host at luncheon that day. Helmuth was knocking out the ashes of his pipe on my hearthstone. He paused in the occupation of refilling it to look down at me in a moody kind of impatience that was the worst I knew of him. There was the suggestion of a cleft in his strong, square chin, which came out whenever he bit hard on a difficult proposition. The play of it now was like the tiny shadow of disaster. "I was down in old Brownlow's office the other day," he went on, talking this Mexican scheme to him, and he had to break off in the middle of it to telephone to some chorus girl he had a date with. God, it made me hot to think of it. "Because I'm in the same—" He cut me off with a sound of vexation. "Don't say it. Don't even think of it." "How long does this contract of yours last?" "To the end of the season," I told him. "Well, you check it just as soon as you can. I'll put this thing through somehow. We'll clear out of here." He had his pipe alight by now and began puffing more contentedly. "I don't think much of this Berg, anyway." He laughed as he settled himself in one of my chairs. "A man doesn't have a chance to get his feet on the ground." There were times when he almost made me share in his distaste for it. That was when I had drawn him into the circle of my professional acquaintances, which somehow shriveled at his touch like spiders in the heat. Understand that I hold by my art, that I have poured myself a libation on that altar, that I value it above all other means of expressing the drama of man's relation to the invisible, and that I do not think you do enough for it, prize it enough, or use it rightly. But I suppose there is a yellow streak in me, or I wouldn't sicken so as I do at what it brings to pass in the personalities by which it is most forwarded. For since it must be that art cannot be served to the world except by a cup emptied of much that is most desirable in the recipients, it ill becomes them, as long as they fatten their souls at it, to take exception to the vessel from which it is drunk. Nevertheless, I used to find myself, when Helmuth was with me, sniffing at the spiritual garments of my friends for the smell of burning. I resented Mr. Lawrence the most. It was not altogether for the incongruity of his possessing Sarah, her fine smudgeless personality and her lovely body, delicate and shapely as a pearl, but for the incontestable evidence he offered me of how low I had stooped. From the peak of my present prosperity, my troubles in Chicago showed the merest accident, and the distance I had sprung away from them seemed somehow expressive of the strength with which I had sprung from all that Lawrence represented, not all the care Sarah bestowed on him, and I think the best he could do for her was to provide her in his impaired health with an occasion for mothering, could quite distract the attention from the ineradicable mark of his cheapness. He was as much out of key with the society in which Sarah's success and mine had placed him as he was flattered to find himself there. It had brought out in him, in the way privation had not, that touch of theatricality which intrigued Sarah's unsophisticated fancy in the first place. He let his hair grow into curls and made a mysterious and incurable pain of his broken health. And though he offered it as the best he had to offer, with humility, he suffered an accession of that devoted manner which had won his way among women of his own class, but which among the sort he met at my rooms was ridiculous. Jerry, too, with his married life in dissolution, for what looked to Helmuth, and in the light of his strong sense, was beginning to look to me like an aimless folly. Out of all these blew a wind witheringly on the fine bloom of my happiness. We did best when we shut it out in a profound, exalted intimacy of passion. What leads me to think that Palatkin must have watched me rather closely all this time is the fact that he waited until Mr. Garrett was gone to London again in the latter part of February to put it to me that if I really meant to leave the stage permanently, and it was a contingency which, in speaking to me of it, he had the wit to speak seriously, I could do no better for myself than to take flight from it from the roof of my own theatre. He put it to me in his own dialect, mixed of the green room and Jewry, that I had torn a large hole in the surrounding professional atmosphere by the vitality of my acting that winter, and that it would be a great shame to go out into the obscurity of marriage without this final pyrotechnic burst. I could have, by his calculation, a short season to open with, and a whole year of brilliant success before anything happened. I think by this time I must have known subconsciously that nothing would happen. It must be because no man naturally can imagine any more compelling business for a woman than being interested in him, that Helmuth failed to understand that he could as well have torn himself from the enterprise for which he had starved and sweated, as separate me from the final banquet of success. I had paid for it, and I must eat. We opened in May, not the best time of year for such an adventure, but I suppose Palatkin was afraid to trust me to the distractions of another vacation. It occurs to me now, though at the time I didn't suspect him, that we couldn't have opened even then if he had not been much more forward with the plan than at any time he had permitted me to guess. At the last I came near, in his estimation, to jeopardizing the whole business by opening with The Winter's Tale, with Sarah in the part of Hermione and myself as Perdita. Jerry was writing me a new play, but in the process of breaking off a marriage that ought never to have begun, he had found no time to complete it. But why, urged Palatkin, if we must fall back on Shakespeare, choose a part that did not introduce me to the audience until the play was half done? He stood out at least for Juliet or Cleopatra. Why, indeed, I retorted, have a theatre of my own if it is not to do as I please in it? I knew, however, that what I could put into Perdita of Willesden Lake and the Woods of Flame would have sustained even a more inconsiderable part. Effie and her husband came on to my opening night. I want to say here, if I have not explicitly said it, that my sister is a wonderful and indispensable woman. When I think of her, the mystery of how she came out of Taylorville full-fledged to her time is greater than the mystery of how I came to be at all. For Effie is absolutely contemporaneous. She lives squarely not only in her century, but in the particular quarter of it now going. No clutch of tradition topples her toward the generation of women past. Most women of my acquaintance are either sodden with leftover conventions or blousy with racing after the to-be, but Effie is compacted, tucked in, detached from but distinctly related to her background of Montecito. She was president of the Woman's Club, chairman of the book committee of the circulating library, and though she had a letter every morning and a telegram every night from the woman with whom she had left her 2 babies, it didn't prevent her in the week she spent with me from getting into touch with more forward movements than I was aware were in operation in New York. But good heavens, Effie, how can you find time for them? It's as much as I can do to attend to my own job. Oh, you're a forward movement yourself. All I'm doing is herding the others up to keep step with you. You know, Olivia, I've wondered if you didn't feel lonely at times, so far ahead that you don't find anybody to line up with. Every time I see a woman step out of the ranks in some achievement of her own, I think, now Olivia will have company. But heavens, I said again, I'm not thinking of the others at all. I don't even know that there are others, or at least who they are. I'm a squirrel in a cage. I go round because I must. I don't know what comes of it.
I'll tell you what comes. Women everywhere getting courage to live lives of their own. Do you remember what you went through in Higgleston? Well, the more women there are like you, the less there will be of that for any of them. It is the conscious movement of us all toward liberty that's going round with you." I was dashed by the breadth and brightness of her view. "Effie," I said, "is this a new kind of toy to dangle before your intelligence to keep it from realizing it isn't getting anywhere?" "Like the love affairs of your friends?" She came back at me promptly. "No, it isn't. Well, I guess it's a religion." I believed as I dressed at the theater that night that it was the contagion of Effie's enthusiasm that keyed me up to a pitch that I thought I shouldn't have reached without Helmuth. I had counted so on his being there for the first night, but he was still in London, and for a week I hadn't heard from him. I needed something then to account, as I proceeded with my part, for the extraordinary richness of power, the delicacy and precision with which I put it over line by line to my audience. I played. Oh, I played. I felt the audience breathing in the pauses like the silent wood. The lights went gold and crimson, and the young dreams were singing. So vivid was the mood that, when from time to time I was swept out on billows of applause before the curtain, I fancied I saw him there, leaning to me, now from a balcony, or standing unobserved in a box behind the Sandersons and some friends of his who had pleased, on his introduction, to take a great interest in me. It was a wonderful night, flooded with the certainty of success as by a full moon. We danced under it in spirit. I believe that Palatkin kissed me. 2 of my young men I saw with their hands on one another's shoulders, capering in the wings, as I was being drawn before the curtain again and again to bob and smile like a cuckoo out of a clock striking the perfect hour. And through it all was the sense of my beloved, the leaf-light touch of his kiss on my cheek, the pressure of his arm, so poignant that as I came out of the theater late with Effie and her husband, I thought I could not bear it to go back to my room and find it empty. "Willis," I said to my brother-in-law, "you must lend me my sister tonight." I was sitting between them in the carriage, each of them holding a hand. I do not know what they were able to get of my acting, but nothing could have kept from them the knowledge of my tremendous success. I could see, though, that in his excited state it wasn't going to be easy for him to spare his young wife, and that made it easier for me as we drew up in front of my door to change my mind suddenly and send her back with him. What really influenced me was the certainty that I could not bear even for Effie to disturb the sense of my lover's presence, which I seemed to feel brooding over the room. I went up the steps warm with it. I had a moment of thinking as I opened the door and found the lights turned on, that my maid had left them on so in anticipation of my return, and then I saw him. He was sitting by the dying fire. He had not heard me come up the stair, for his head was in his hands. He turned then at my exclamation, and I had time before we crossed the width of the room to one another to think that the attitude in which I had found him, and the new writing of anxiety in his face as he turned it to me, had its source in his finding me in what looked like a permanent relation to a theatre of my own. For a moment I thought that, and then my apprehension was buried on his breast. "Oh, my love, my love." He held me off from him to let his eyes rove tenderly over my face, my breast, my hair. I do not know if he remembered the words he had spoken to me so long ago, or if they came spontaneously to the command of the old desire. "Oh, you beauty, you wonder." Presently we went to sit down and stumbled over his bag upon the floor beside his chair. It brought me back to the miracle of his being there and to the certainty that he must have come to me direct from the steamer. "On the Cunarder," he admitted. 6 days and a half. Oh, Lord! His gesture was expressive of the extreme weariness of impatience. "I came ashore with the quarantine officers. I couldn't cable. I left at 2 hours' notice." It occurred to me that he must have at least come ashore before sunset, and in that case he couldn't have come straight to me. I began to feel something ominous in the presence there of his bag. His overcoat, though the evening was so warm, lay beyond him on another chair. It flashed over me in a wild way that he had come to some sudden determination. He had been at the theatre that night. He had taken my being there in that circumstance as final. Perhaps he meant to abandon me to my art, to surrender me, at least, to its more importunate claim. He followed my thought duly from far off. "I was at the theatre in time for your part," he said. "There wasn't a seat, but they knew me at the box office and let me in." "Then it was you I saw on the balcony, in the Sandersons' box? I thought it was a vision." "I had business with Sanderson." He turned back to what was beginning to make itself felt through his profound preoccupation, the charm of my presence. "There was that in your acting tonight that would have evoked visions," he smiled. "I had them myself." I knelt down on the floor beside his knees. "Helmuth, tell me," I begged. He began to stroke my face with his hand. "It doesn't seem so bad as it did a few moments ago, and yet it is bad enough. I must leave for Mexico in an hour." "Leave me?" I was still in my mind occupied with what now began to seem a monstrous disloyalty to him, my obligation to Polatkin. There had been a great deal about our new venture on the program. Even if he hadn't seen the papers, he must have learned it as soon as he came into the theatre. "Unless you can go with me in an hour. Yes, dear, I know it is impossible." He was silent a while, clasping and unclasping my hand on his knees, knitting his brows and staring into the fire with the expression of a man so long occupied with anxiety that his mind, in any moment of release, goes back to it automatically. I stirred presently when I saw that his perplexity had nothing to do with me. "I had a cable in London," he said. "Heaven only knows how long they were getting it down to the coast where they could send it. They have struck water in the mines." I failed to get the force of the announcement, except that from the manner of his telling it, it was a great disaster. "I must leave on the 12:23, he warned me. I did understand that. "Oh, no, no, Helmuth," I cried out. "Not now, not so soon." I clung to him, crying, "Stay with me tonight, just for tonight." We rocked in one another's arms. I remembered little broken snatches of explanation. "I've worked so, Olivia. I've worked and sweated, and now—" Presently he broke out again. "To have worked and know that your work is sound, and to be played a trick, to lose by a ghastly trick. If there is a God, Olivia, why does he play tricks on a man like that?" "Hush, my dear. Oh, my dear." "Do you know what I've been doing since I came ashore? I've been buying pumps, Olivia, pumps, and machinery to work them. Think of the delay. I'll have to ask Shane for more money, and I meant to be paying dividends." He held me off from him fiercely with both hands. "Olivia, suppose tonight, instead of applause, you had heard hisses, and people going out, turning their backs on you in your best lines. Oh," he broke off and covered his face with his hands. I crept up to him. "If they had, I should have come back to you, beloved, and I shouldn't have remembered it. Oh, beloved, what are all things worth except that they give us this?" I was on his knee now, and my hair was still in its maiden snood, as it had been in the play. I drew it softly about his face. "Oh, my dear, to be this to me, what does it matter about the mines? It will come straight again in a little time. But this is now." I could feel the yielding in his frame. He was my man, and I did what I would with him. End of Book 4, Chapter 6. Book 4, Chapter 7 of A Woman of Genius by Mary Hunter Austen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Book 4, Chapter 7. Among all the devices with which we confound the powers forever fumbling at our lives, none must puzzle them more than the set of obligations and interactions that go by the name of business, unless, indeed, there is a God of business, which I doubt. Past all misguiding of our youth, past all time and distance and unlikelihood, the God who would be worshipped most by the welding of spirit into spirit had brought us two together, only to be rived apart by the necessity which tied us each, not only to our own, but to other people's means of making a living. The 2 or 3 hours following on Helmuth's announcement of the accident, which had, who knows but at the instance of the powers which was bent upon uniting us, shattered the point of his attachment to the Mexican scheme, we spent in that drowning realization of the source of being and delight for each in the other, which is the process and the end of loving. And then the withdrawing of the whole electric constellations from the city skyline, and the clatter of the morning traffic in the street, and the dispersing blueness, let in with them the considerations which whipped us apart. If there is a God of business, he is of a superior subtlety, for even then we proposed to one another that the best way of being quit of the obligation was to serve our time to it, and it was in pursuance of some such idea that I found myself, toward the latter part of June, going out to Los Angeles to meet Mr. Garrett, who would by that time have come up the coast from Mazatlan to make purchases of supplies. I should have gone much farther than that merely to have touch with him, the warm pressure of his hand, his voice at my ear. All my dreams even were tinged by the loss out of my life of his bodily presence. It was a singular flame-touch circumstance that the assured success of my new venture set up in me a fiercer need. There had not been time for much in his letters but accounts of his struggle with conditions at the mine and his slow conquest of the water that flooded all the lower levels, of disheartening, incompetent labor, and the multiplied difficulty of distance from any base of supplies. But that little was all time to our meeting again. "I will explain all that when I see you. We will talk of that later," were phrases that cropped out in his letters many times. I did not know, even in the act of going there, just what he expected to bring to pass in our affairs by my being in Los Angeles. I only know that I desperately wanted to see him. One thing I gathered from his letters, that in the preoccupation and haste of his stay in New York, he had wholly missed the significance of my new entanglement with Morris Palatkin. I have to suppose, to account for his never having any other conception of what my work was to me, that he had never known a professional woman, or one who worked at anything except as a stopgap during the inconsequence of youth and marriage. He felt himself humbly rather a poor substitute for the color, the excitement and gaiety of my career. Why should so many people suppose that an actress's life is gay? But he balanced that with what he meant to purchase for me by his own achievement. He had, without thinking it necessary to account for it, the idea that is so generally and unexcusedly entertained that I am sometimes hypnotized into thinking it must be the right one, that a woman in becoming a man's wife ceases to be her own and becomes somehow mysteriously and inevitably his. It was not that in all our talk about it he had any conclusions about the stage as an unsuitable profession for women, but that he was inherently unable to think of it as possible for his wife. We were saved from dispute by the proof I had had in Italy that his inability to think of me as having a life apart arose chiefly in his need of me, which had in it something of the absolute quality of a child's need of its mother. I am glad now, in view of all that came of it, that I was spared the bitterness of not seeing, in his inability to accept the finality of my relation to my work. anything nobler than an insufferable male egotism. I have thought since that we might have made more of our love if we had but seen somewhere in the world the process of its being so made, if we could have moved for a time in a footing of intimacy among other pairs who had produced out of as unlikely material a competent and satisfying frame of life. We do not know any but theatrical people among whom the wife had interests apart from her husband. That is where Taylorville betrayed us. And now you know what I meant when I said in the beginning that the social ideal, in which I was bred, is the villain of my plot. For we wished sincerely for the best, and the best that we knew was cast only in one mould. I have begun to think indeed that this, more than anything else, accounts for the personal disaster which waits so often on the heels of genius, that we assume it to be the inalienable condition. For genius tends to spring from that stratum of society for which, when it has come to its full flower, it is most unfit, and it comes up slanting and aside like a blade of grass under a potsherd of the broken mold of unrelated ideals. Somewhere there must have been men and women working out our situation, and working it out successfully, but the only example life afforded us was not of the acceptable pattern. Still my agreement with Mr. Garrett, that it was, after all, the pattern, saved us from mutual accusation and recrimination. Concerned as I was to make the most and the best of him, I kept looking out all the way after the train struck into the southwest for every intimation of the life there which would have helped me to get at the springs of his behavior, and was by turns shocked away from its bleakness and drawn with a rush of sympathy toward what a man must endure to live in it. If I saw myself as he had sometimes sketched me, filling its bleak and unprofitable reaches with my gift as with flame and flower, I was as many times shudderingly brought face to face with the question as to where in the wilderness I was to find wherewithal to go on burning. At Los Angeles, a town of which I had heard him speak as a place with the spirit with which he was in sympathy, I had nothing to look at for a week but a great deal of rather formless, wooden architecture expressing nothing so much as the attempt to reconcile Taylorvillian tastes and perceptions with a subtropical opportunity. I do not know what that city may have become since I visited it, but at the time it was notable for a disposition to take the amplitude of its pretension for performance. Its theatrical season, if it had any, had dwindled to that exorable sort of entertainment which comes up in any community like a weed when the women are out of town, and if there had been anybody I knew there, I should have been debarred from making myself known to them until I had seen Mr. Garrett and learned his plans. I took to spending my time as far out of town as I could manage, and by degrees a strange seductive beauty began to make itself felt with me, a large, unabashed kind of beauty that disdained prettiness and dared to dispense with charm. It was a land ribbed and sinewed with all I had set my hand to, making free with it as kings do with their dignity, and the moment Helmeth came, before the warmth of renewal had its way with us, I saw that the land had set its mark on him. He was thinner, his manner hurried, obsessed. There are times, no doubt, when loving must be set aside for the sterner business of living, but it wasn't what I had come to Los Angeles for. I was flushed with success. I had spread the crest of my femininity. I was prepared to be adorable, enchanting. And I found that what was expected of me was to sit by in my room in the hotel, on the chance of his having time for me between the exigencies of buying cogwheels and iron piping. He was so tired at times that I was made to feel that my demand upon him for the lover's attitude was an additional harassment, and there was so little else I could do for him. Not that I wouldn't have been glad to have done him a wifely service, laid out his clothes and seen to it that he had his meals regularly, but what I could do was subservient to the necessity of keeping our relations secret. It struck witheringly on all my sweet illusion of what I could be to him, to have it so brought home to me that the uses of affection are largely dependent on the habit of living together. At any rate, I said, consoling myself for his scant hours with me, we shall have all day Sunday together. Helmeth, you don't mean to say— Something curiously like embarrassment suffused him. I shall have to spend most of Sunday at Pasadena, at the Howards. The girls are there, you know. I didn't know, and the circumstance of its having been kept from me smacked of offense. Why, since I had been good enough to come all this distance to comfort him with loving, had he not explained to me that I must share him with the children? Why not have at least included me in a community of interest with them? I thought, he extenuated, that the girls were the chief obstacle to your marrying me, that you might get to feel differently about them if you didn't have them thrust too much upon you. Oh, Helmeth! I began to imagine a perversity in his avoidance of the main issue. It isn't the girls. It isn't anything of yours. It is something of mine. It is my art you aren't willing for me to bring into the family with me. It is because, then, I'm not accustomed to think of the stage as being the sort of thing that belongs in a family. I thought you agreed with me about that. He had me there. If I had seen a way to separate all that I loved in my art from all that was most objectionable in the practice of it, I should have married him and trusted to carrying my point afterward. I had a vision of Helmeth's girls overhearing Palakin advising me about the fit of my corsets, and me calling him Polly. I came back on another path to my recently awakened resentment. Just the same, you ought to have told me. Mrs. Howard is Miss Stanley's sister, isn't she? They don't live together. He had answered my unspoken question as though the ideas that were forming in my head had been in juxtaposition in his own before. Miss Stanley and the young brother, you remember him at Cadenabia, live at the old place. She has been a mother to him. Ah, I couldn't forbear to suggest, and she's mothering your children now. Good heavens, Olivia, you are not jealous, are you? Yes, I am, I told him. I'm jealous of every minute you spend away from me. I'm jealous of the men you do business with, men who can talk with you, hear your voice. Oh, my dear, my dear. I put my hands up to his shoulders and cried a little upon his breast. His arms were about me. For me all time and place dissolved only to keep them there. Look here, Olivia, if you feel this way, let us go and be married today, and then we can spend Sunday all together. I did not mean to urge you just now. Things are pretty rough with me. It'll be a year or two before I can straighten them out, but after all, I guess our feelings count for something. I couldn't, I protested. You don't understand. There's Palakin and Jerry. He has written this play for me. We are all tied up together. You know how it would be if any of your partners should withdraw. A woman has no business to be tied up to any man but her husband, he broke out. Think of any other man being able to tell my wife what she should or shouldn't do. We went over that ground again until we ceased from sheer exhaustion. It came to this at last, that he proposed that I should marry him at once. I could go back to Mexico with him. I hadn't to begin rehearsals until September. We could have the summer together, and then I could go back to my work until he could claim me. For a wild moment I yielded to the suggestion, if I could have him and my art. But I hope I am not altogether a cad. I saw what all his efforts could not keep me from seeing, that even to do that for me, to get me into his place in Mexico and back again, would be a tax on him, and to ask him to do it with a reservation in my mind would be more than I would stand for. It isn't fair, Helmuth, my letting you think that anything could pull me away from this stage. It isn't that I don't agree with you about how a husband and wife ought to be with one another, nor that I am not entirely of the opinion that the atmosphere of the stage is not the place to bring up children the way you want yours brought up. It is because not even the kind of marriage you offer me would hold me. You mean that you'd leave me, that you'd go back to it? Well, why not? I left my first husband. I know that wasn't the way it seemed to me then, but that's what it amounted to, and he fell in love with the village dressmaker. I had never told him that part of my life. I had never thought of it in the terms in which I had just stated it. I saw him grow slowly white under the sun-brown of his skin. I see. If your only idea in staying with me is that I might— Good God, Olivia, do you know what you've said to me? Nothing except what is right for you to know. Do you remember, Helmuth, what I told you Mark Eversley called me? A woman of genius. I remember. He was looking at me now as though the phrase were a sort of acid test which brought out in me traits unsuspected before. Well, then I'm those two things, a woman and a genius. And the woman was meant for you. Don't think I don't know that, and I'm not proud of it with every fiber of my brain and body. I should have been glad once. If it were possible, I'd be glad now to have kept your house and borne your children, and see to it that they brushed their teeth and had hair ribbons to match their clothes. Their mother thought that was important. He snatched at this as at an incontestable evidence of my being all that I was trying to show him that I was not. It is important. I remember to this day the effect on me of my hair ribbons. He broke in eagerly. If you can see that, if you understand what their mother wanted. Things I missed out of my life through having no mother, that I've heard you say you missed partly out of yours. Birthdays and Christmas and good chances to marry when they grow up. I do understand, Helmuth, but what I'm trying to tell you is that I can't go through with it. Those are the things that belong to the woman, that it takes all the woman's time to do the way their mother would have them done. And for me, the woman has been swamped in the genius. I don't say that I'm not a better actress for having tried so long to be merely a woman, for being able even now to know all that you mean when you say woman, but there it is. I am an actress, and I can't leave off being one just by saying so. And I can't leave off being a proper father to my girls. I owe them the things we've been talking about just as I owe them a living. I suppose I should have married for their sakes, supposing I could get anybody to have me, even if I hadn't found you. And I don't want finding you to mean anything but the best to them. I had nothing to say to that, and he went back to a thought that had often been between us. We ought to have married when we were young. He insisted as though somehow that made a better case of it. If you hadn't begun, you wouldn't have been called on to leave it off. The point is that it won't leave me. Genius, I don't know what it is except that it is nothing to be conceited about because you can't help it. Isn't a thing you can pick up or lay down at your pleasure. It's a possession. I could see that he didn't altogether follow me, that he was not very far removed, and that only by his admiration for me, from the Taylorvillian idea that to speak of yourself as a genius was to pay yourself an unwarrantable compliment, and that the most I could get him to understand of the meaning of my work was what grew out of his being a most competent workman himself. he went back to the original proposition. "Does that mean, then, that you are not going to marry me?" "It means that I'm not going to leave the stage to do it." "It seems to me to mean that you don't love me as you have professed to." "Oh, I know how women love. Good women. Helmeth." "I beg your pardon, Olivia." We stood aghast at what we had brought upon ourselves. Across the breach of dissension we rushed together with effacing passion. After all, I believe I should have gone with him if he had had the wit to know that the point at which a woman is most prepared for yielding is the next instant after she has just stated the insuperable objection. Whether he knew it or not, the whole of his outer attention was taken up with the purchase of pump fittings. Understand that I didn't for a moment suppose that I had lost him, that I didn't believe anything but that I could go to him at any moment if the whim seized me, that I couldn't in reason pull him back if the need of him arose. I finished out my vacation at resorts up and down the California coast, warm with the certainty that I should see him in New York the next winter. End of Book 4, Chapter 7. Book 4, Chapter 8 of A Woman of Genius by Mary Hunter Austen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Book 4, Chapter 8. The next season was a brilliant one, made so by the strength of my wanting him, and by the sense of completeness and finality which came to me out of the faith that we had been ordained to be lovers from the beginning. It began to seem, in the fashion in which we had been brought together as boy and girl, and then mated in ways which, credible as they had been, yet offered no obstacle to the freshness and vitality of our passion, that we had been guided by that intelligence which in any emergency of my gift I felt rushed to save it, that I had been prevented from any absorbing interest until it had grown and flowered in me, appeared now to have come about by direct manipulation of the powers. I had curious and interesting adventures that winter in the farthest unexplored territory of the artistic consciousness, which tempt me at every turn to put by my story for the purpose of making them plain to you, and I am only deterred from it by the certainty that you couldn't get it plain in any case. A few days ago I picked up a copy of Dante, and found myself convicted of shallowness in never having taken his passion for the cold-blooded Beatrice seriously, by finding the evidence of its absolute quality in the circle within circle of his hells and paradisos, the rhythm of aches and exaltations. And if you couldn't get that from Dante, how much less from anything I might have to say to you? After all these years I do not know what is the relation of art to passion, but I have experienced it. If I said anything, it would be by way of persuading you that loving is not an end in itself, but the pull upward to our native heaven, which is no hymn-book heaven, but a world of the spirit, wherein things are made and remade and called good. What I made out of it at that time was the material of a satisfying success, and though I got on without him much better than I could have expected, the fact that after all he did not get any nearer to me than the Pacific coast had its effect in the year's adventures. That I missed my lover infinitely, that I was thinned in the body by the sheer want of him, that I had moments of mad resolve, of passionate self-abandoning cry to him, goes without saying. One need not in a certain society say more of love than that one has it, to be understood as well as if one displayed a yellow ribbon in the company of Orangemen. But since I couldn't say it, an opinion passed current among my friends that I was working too hard and in need of a holiday. It came around at last to Palakin himself noticing it, though I believe with a better understanding of the reason why I should be restless and sleepless-eyed. It was just after I had heard from Helmuth that he couldn't possibly hope to be in New York for another year that my manager suggested that it might be good business policy for me to play a short tour in 3 or 4 of the leading cities, a strictly limited season which would be enough to whet the public appetite without satisfying it. What cities? I believe that I jumped at it in the hope somehow that it might be stretched to include Los Angeles, where Helmuth was at the moment, and where I felt sure he would come to me. When I learned, however, that nothing was contemplated farther west than Chicago, I lost interest. That very day I had a telegram. "Will you marry me?" Signed, Garrett. It was dated at Los Angeles, and as I could think of no reason for this urgency, I concluded that it must be because the association there with the idea of me had been too much for him, and in that new yielding of mine to the beguiling circumstance, I was disposed to interpret it as evidence that he was coming round. I wired back, "If you marry my work, Olivia," and prepared myself for the renewal of that dear struggle which, if it got us no further, at least involved us in coil upon coil of emotion, making him by the very force he spent on it more completely mine. I expected him in every knock on the door, every foot on the stair, and had he come to me then, would no doubt have provoked him to that traditional conquest which, as it has its root in a situation made, effected for the express purpose of provocation, is the worst possible basis for a successful marriage. On the day on which, at the earliest, I could have expected him from Los Angeles, I sent my maid away in order that, if I should find him there in the old place waiting for me, there should be no constraint on the drama of assault and surrender for which I found myself primed. Then by degrees it began to grow plain to me that he did not mean to come, that the question and my answer to it had carried some sort of finality to his mind that was not apparent to mine. By the time I had a letter from him, written at the mine, with no reference in it to what had passed so recently between us, I understood that he would not ask me to marry him again. He had accepted the situation of being my lover merely, and I was not any more to be vexed by the alternative. I said to myself that it was better to have it resolved with so little pain, and that it should be my part to see that what we were to one another was to yield its proper fruit of happiness. I found myself at a loss, however, in the application, for though you may have satisfied yourself of the moral propriety of dispensing with the convention of publicity, you cannot very well, with a week's journey between you, get forward in the business of making a man happy. About this time Jerry began to be anxious about what I couldn't prevent showing in my face, the wasting evidence of love divided from its natural use of loving. "You break down altogether," he expostulated, "and then where will I be?" He was tremendously interested in his new play, which was by far the best thing he had done, and in the process of getting it to the public he had so identified it with my interpretation that he was no longer able to think of the one without the other. There had come into his manner a new solicitude very pleasing to me, born of his sense of possession in me, inasmuch as I was the lovely lady of his play, and a sort of awe of all that I put into it that transcended his own notion, and yet was so integral a part of it. It had brought him out of his old acceptance of me as a foil and relief for the shallow iridescence that other women produced in him. He had begun to have for me a little of that calculating tenderness with which a man might regard the mother of his nursing child. Night by night, then, as he came hovering about me, he could not fail to observe, though he could hardly have understood it, the wearing hunger with which I came from my work, pushed on by it to more and more desperate need of loving, and drawn back by its unrelenting grip from the artistic ruin in which the satisfaction of that hunger would involve me. Now, at his very natural expression of concern, I felt myself unaccountably irritated. "Jerry," I demanded of him, "would it matter so much if we left off altogether writing plays and playing them?" "What would it matter?" "You are in a bad way if you've begun to question that. What does living matter? We are here and we have to go on." "Yes, but when we go on at such pains, is there any more behind us than there is behind a ball when it is set rolling? Are we aimed at anything?" "Oh, Lord, Olivia, what has that got to do with it?" He was sitting in my most commodious chair with his long knees crossed to prop up a manuscript from which he was reading me the notes of a tragedy he was about to undertake, and his quills were almost erect with the tweaking he had given them in the process of arriving at his climax. It was a curious fact that the breaking off of his marriage, which in the nature of the case could not be broken off sharp, but had writhed and frayed him like the twisting of a green stick, by setting Jerry free for those light adventures of the affections which had been so largely responsible for the rupture of his domestic relations, instead of multiplying his propensity by his opportunity, had landed him on a plane of self-realization in which they were no longer needful. The poet in Jerry would never be able to resist the attraction of youth and freshness, but the man in him was forever and unassailably beyond their reach. I was never more convinced of this than when he turned on this occasion from the preoccupation of his creative mood to offer whatever his point of attachment life had provided him to bridge across the chasm of my spirit. "I don't see why it is important that we should know what we are working for. We might, in our confounded egotism, not approve of it. We might even think we could improve on the pattern. I write plays, and you act them, and a bee makes honey. I suppose there's a beekeeper about, but that's none of our business." Ah, if we could only be sure of that. If he would only make himself manifest. That's what I'm looking for. Just a hint of what he's trying to do with us. "Well, I can tell you, he'll smoke you out of New York and into a sanitarium if you don't know enough to take a change and a rest. Polly wants me to go on the road for a while. Sort of triumphal progress. He thinks applause will cure me." "You're getting that now. What would bring you around would be a good frost." "You wouldn't want that in Chicago." Jerry disentangled his limbs and sat up sniffing the wind of success. "If I could have you to open with my play in Chicago," he averred solemnly, "I'd be ready to sing 'The Lord Dismiss Us.'" He really thought so, to go back to the scene of his early struggle with his laurels fresh on him, to satisfy the predictions of his earliest friends and confound his detractors, above all to be received in his own country with that honor which is denied to prophets, seemed to him then almost as desirable in prospect as it proved in fact not to be. I found another advantage in the confusion and excitement of touring, in being able to conceal from myself that I hadn't a satisfactory letter from Helmouth since the pair of telegrams that passed between us, and no letter at all for a long time. It was always possible to pretend to myself that the letters had been written but were delayed in forwarding. It was a raw spring day when we came to Chicago, the promise of the season in the sun, denied and flouted by the wind. It slanted the tails of the laboring teams and cast over the clean furrow handfuls of the winter rubbish from the stubble yet unturned, and between field and field it wrung the tops of the leafless wood. Now and then it parted them on white painted spires, without disturbing them or the rows of thin white gravestones. It laid bare the roots of my life to the cold blasts of memory. It rendered me again the pagan touch, the undivided part that the earth had in me. My dead were in its sod, in me the sap of its spiritual fervors and renunciations. What was I? What was my art but the flower, the bright exotic blossom borne upon its topmost bough, its dying top? Here in its abounding villages, in the deep-rutted county roads, was the root and trunk. Outside, the wind flicked the landscape like the screen of the moving picture that the swift roll of the train made of it, and I felt again the pressure of my small son upon my arm, and the pleasant stir of domesticity and the return of my man. For the last hour Jerry had come to sit in my compartment opposite me and stare stonily out of the window. Now and then his jaws relaxed and set again as he bit hard upon the bitter end of experience. No one, I suppose, can go through that country so teeming with the evidences of the common life, the common labor, the common hope of immortality, and not feel bereft inasmuch as the circumstances of his destiny divide him from it. We passed Higgleston. Beyond the roofs of it, the elms that mark the cemetery road gathered green. The roofs of the town were steeped in windy light. I had no impulse to stop there. I withdrew from it as one does from a private affair upon which he has stumbled unaware. Rather, it was not I who withdrew, but life, as it was lived there, turned its back upon me. Getting into Chicago through that smoky wooden wilderness, within which the city obscures itself as a cuttlefish in its own inky cloud, I felt again the wounding and affront, the cold shoulder lifted on my needs, the eager hand stretched out to catch my contribution. Chicago received me with its hat off, bowing to meet me, and when I remembered how nearly it had let me fall into the pit prepared for me by Griffin and the flimflams, I burned with resentment. It was 7 years now since I had seen the city, or Pauline, the only friend I had made there who could be supposed to take an interest in my coming again. I meant, of course, to see Pauline. We had kept up a correspondence which with the years had shown a disposition to confine itself to a Christmas reminder and an occasional marked copy of a magazine. But I meant, of course, to see her. I had trusted to her finding out through the newspaper that I would be there, and on such a date. It fell in quite naturally with my inclination to have her card sent up to me the next morning a little after 11. I was needing to be distracted. On my way up from breakfast, I had met Jerry going down with his suitcase. "Back to New York," he admitted to my question, "as quick as I can get there." But with all this success, why, they fairly stood on their feet last night. I know. He looked unendurably harassed. "I can't stand it, Olivia, I can't stand it. This place is full of ghosts." I remembered that both his children had been born there, and that he had not seen them for more than a year, and I did not press him. "I'll keep your end up for a week if I can," I assured him as he wrung my hand. He turned back when he was a step or two down the stair. "Don't stay too long yourself," he admonished. "New York's the place." I was feeling that when Pauline came to me. It wasn't until I saw her that I realized what a distance there was, in spite of our common youth, had always been, between us. It started out for us both in the first glimpse we had of one another, in the witness in all the inconsiderable elements of line and color which go to make up a woman's appearance, of growth and amplitude in me, and fulfillment in hers. Pauline had been in her girlhood, if not pretty, at least what is known as an attractive girl, and though there was only a matter of months between us, it came to me with a shock that she was now not only not particularly attractive, but middle-aged. It was not so much in the fullness under her chin, which apparently caused her no uneasiness, nor in the thickness of her waist, of which I was sure she made a virtue, but in the certainty that all that was ever to happen to her in the way of illuminating and self-forgetting passion had already happened. She must have reached about the time I was taking my flight upward by the help of Morris Palatkin, the full level of her capacity to experience. She was living still, as I saw by the card which I still held in my hand, in Evanston, and she was living there because it was no longer within the scope of her possibility to live anywhere else. All this flashed through me in the moment in which Pauline, checked by what she was able to guess of unfamiliar elements in me, was crossing the room and taking me by the hands in the old womanly way, keyed down to the certainty of not requiring it in her business any more. It was so patent that Pauline was now in the position of having done her duty toward life in Henry Mills, and was accepting all that came to her from it as her due, that it almost seemed for a moment that she had said something of the kind. What did pass between us, besides a kiss of greeting, were some commonplaces about my being there and how pleased Henry and the children would be to see me. We sat down on a sofa together, and for a moment the old girlish confidence put forth a tender sprig of renewal.
So many years since we were at school together. You've gone a long way since then, Olivia.
A long way, I admitted, but she didn't catch the double meaning the phrase had for me.
Henry and I were talking about it this morning, and the times you had here in Chicago. You poor dear, you had to make a good many starts before you got on the right road at last.
A great many.
But you found out that it all came right in the end, didn't you? That it was best just for you to trust. You used to be bitter about it. But trusting is always best.
Oh, if you think I've been trusting all these years, I've been working.
Of course.
Much of her old manner came back with the occasion for moralizing.
But you were too amusing. You were quite fierce with Henry because he wouldn't do anything about it.
She laughed reminiscently. And now you see.
Her look traveled about the rose-colored room, full of the evidence of prosperity.
Pauline, I said, if you are thinking that I could have gone to New York and become the success I am, without the help that you and Henry might have given me, you are making a great mistake. What did happen was that I had to accept it from a quarter where it wasn't so much to be expected and was not nearly so agreeable.
That man Mark Eversley found for you, you mean? Well, I suppose you did get on better for a little start.
Start? I cried. Start? I had to have everything, food and clothes. A sudden recollection flashed upon me of those first days in New York, of myself become merely a dummy on which to hang a fat little Jew's notion of acceptable contours. The offense of it, the greater offense from which, by the opportune appearance of the Jew, I had so hardly escaped. Have you any idea, Pauline, what it means to have a man invest money in you? A man like Palakin. I was his property, a horse. He had entered for the race. He had a stake on me. Pauline looked aghast. Vague recollections of the actress heroines of fiction shaped her thought. You don't mean to say, Olivia, that you were his mistress? I finished for her bluntly. Is that the only thing your imagination takes offense at? Isn't it enough for me to tell you that he orders my corsets for me? That did reach her. I could see her struggle with the habitual effort to put the unwelcome fact down, anywhere out of sight and knowledge, under the cotton wool of a moral sentiment. Even now, if she could escape being implicated in my predicament by avoiding the knowledge of it, she would not only do that, but convict herself of superiority as well. My gorge rose against it. But if I didn't sell myself to the Jew, I drove it home to her, it was chiefly because he was decenter to me than the circumstance gave me a right to expect. I came near doing it for a cheaper man, and for a cheaper price, a man who had deserted one wife, and a bigamist, in fact. If you don't know that there were days when I would have sold myself for something to eat, it was because you didn't take the pains to.
But you never said a word
Of course, if you had told me the truth. She floundered and saved herself on what she believed to be a just resentment, but I had no notion of letting her off so easily. I did not know exactly how we had got launched on the subject. It had not been in my mind to do so when she came in, but all the events of the past year seemed to lead up to it, to come somehow to the point of rupture against her smooth acceptance of my success as being derived from the same process as her own. "I did tell you that I was in need of money to put me in the way of earning a living," I insisted. "I did not ask you for charity. What I offered you was the chance of a business investment, one that rendered the investor its due return. The fact that you did not know enough about the business to know how good it was," I forestalled what I saw rising to her lips, "had nothing to do with it. You were my friend and professed to admire my talent. I had a right to have what I said about it heard respectfully." I had got up from the pink and white sofa where our talk had begun, and was trailing about the room in my breakfast gown, and the suggestion of staginess in the way the folds of it followed my movements irritated me with the certainty that the effect of it on Pauline would be to mitigate the sincerity of what I said. "You'd known me long enough," I accused her, "to know that I wouldn't have asked for money until I was in the last extremity, and then I wouldn't have asked for it for myself. I don't know that it would have mattered if I had starved, but my gift was worth saving." "I didn't dream," she began. "I hadn't any idea." "Well, why didn't you ask Henry then? Henry knows what becomes of women on the stage when they can't make a living." This was nearer to the mark than I had meant to let myself go, but I could see that it carried no illumination. She drew up her wrap and braced herself for one more gallant effort. "The things you've been through, my dear. I don't wonder you feel bitter. But when it has all come out right, why not forget it?" "Oh, right, right." The room was full of vases and floral tokens of the triumph of the night before, and as I swung about with my arms out, disdaining her judgment of rightness for me, I knocked over a great basket of roses and orchids which had come from Klein and Erskine. I don't suppose Pauline had ever knocked over anything in her life, and the violence of my gesture must have stood for some unloosening of the bonds of convention, with an implication which only now began to work through to her. "You don't mean to say, Olivia, that you are not a good woman?" "Oh," I said again, "good. Good. What does it all mean? I'm a successful actress." "Olivia!" "Well, no, if you insist on knowing. I'm not what you would call a good woman." I threw it at her as though it had been a peculiar kind of scorn heaped up on her for being what I had just denied myself to be. I saw myself for once with all my thwarted and misspent instincts toward the proper destiny of women, enmeshed and crippled not by any propensity for sinning, but by the conditions of loving which women like Pauline set up for me. "And if you want to know," I said, "why I am not a good woman, it is because women like you don't make it seem particularly worthwhile." "Oh," she gasped, "this is horrible, horrible." The word came out in a whisper. I saw at last that she was done with me, that the only thought that was left to her was to get away, to put as much space as possible between us. I got around with my hand on the door to prevent her. "Pauline, Pauline!" I cried almost wildly, as if even at the last she could have helped me from myself. "Can't you remember that we grew up together, that we had the same training, the same ideals? Can't you remember that when we began I thought the life you had chosen for yourself was the best, that I thought I had chosen it for myself too? Only, for heaven's sake, Pauline, try to understand me. There is something that chooses for us. Don't you know that I wouldn't have been any different from what you are if I hadn't been forced? Haven't you seen how I've been beaten back from all that I tried to be? All this, I threw out my arms as I stood against the door, to include all that had entered by implication in our conversation. It had to come, and it came wrong, because you won't understand that a gift has its own way with us. I could see, though, that she wasn't understanding in the least, that she was badly scared and even indignant at being forced to listen to a justification of what, by her code, could have no justification. She was standing not far from me, crushed against the wall, as though by the weight of opprobriousness that I heaped upon her, and her whole attention was centered on the door and the chance of getting out of it and away from what, in the mere despair of reaching her intelligence with it, I flung out from me now wildly. "I suppose," I scoffed, "that it never occurs to you that a gifted woman could be as delicate and feminine as anybody, if only you didn't make her right to fostering care and protection conditional on her giving up her gift altogether. You," I demanded, "who tie up all the moral values of living to your own little set of behaviors, what right have you to deny us the opportunity to be loved honestly, because you can't, at the same time, make us over into replicas of yourselves?" I was sick with all the shames and struggles of the women I had known. I forgot the door and went over to her. "You," I said, "who fatten your moral superiority on the best of all we produce, how do you suppose you are going to make us value the standards you set up, when the price you despise us for paying, 9 times out of 10 we pay to the men who belong to you? What right have you to judge what we have done when you've neither help nor understanding to offer us in the doing? What right? What right?" For the moment I had turned away in the vehemence of my indignation. I was pacing up and down. In the instant when my attention was distracted from the door, Pauline made a dart for it. I could hear her scurrying down the hall, but I went on walking up and down in my room and talking aloud to her. I was beside myself with the sum of all indignities. Was it not this set of prejudices which for the moment had presented itself in the person of Pauline Mills, which at every turn of my life had been erected against the burgeoning of my gift? Was it not in the process of combating the tradition of the preciousness of women as inherent in particular occupations, that I had lost the inestimable preciousness of myself? Was it for what came out of Pauline's frame of life? I thought of Cecilia Brune here, that I had sacrificed my public possession of the man I loved, and what came out of it that was more to the world than what I had to offer? Had I cut myself off from the comfort and stability of a home, simply because in my situation as famous tragedian I didn't see my way to bring up Helmuth's children so as to make little Pauline Millses of them? I was still raging formlessly in this fashion when Miss Summers, our ingenue, came to tell me that the cab waited to take us to the theatre for the matinee. All through the performance, which I was told went remarkably well, I was conscious of nothing but the seismic shudders and upheavals of my world too long subjected to strain. It came back on me in intervals through the evening performance. I was physically sick with it. But by degrees, through its subsidence, new worlds began to rise. By the time I left the theatre that night, I knew what I would do. It had been a mistake, a natural but cruel mistake, for Helmuth and me to suppose that a way of living could at any time be worth the very sap and source of life. Love was the central fact around which all modes and occupations should arrange themselves. Let us but love, then, and live as we may. In all the world there was no need like the need I had for his breast, his arm. Always the point of our conclusions had been that I agreed with him, that I had thought that failing to repeat the pattern of their mother and his children, I had failed in all, that I didn't any more than he see my way to keeping on with my work and meeting him at the door every night when he came home, in the sort of garment that in the ladies' journals went by the name of house gown. I laughed to think that we had not seen before, that it was ridiculous. I had no more doubt now, no more trepidation. What burned in me was so clear a flame that he could not but be illuminated. Only let me find him, let me go to him again. At the hotel desk where I paused for my key, I asked them to send up telegraph blanks to my room. With them came letters forwarded from New York. I started, as one does at an unexpected presence, to find an envelope among them with his familiar superscription. For the first time I would rather not have had a letter from him. It would be interposing a fresher picture between me and my new resolution to put him for the moment farther from me. I saw then that the letter in my hand had been posted at Los Angeles. It was as though he had leaped suddenly all that distance nearer than is Chillicothe, Mexico. I noticed that it was a very thin letter. 1,000 conjectures rushed upon me, not one of them with any relativity to what I would find, for when I tore it open there floated out a printed slip. It was a clipping from a Pasadena newspaper, and announced his engagement to Edith Stanley.
End of Book 4, Chapter 8. Book 4, Chapter 9 of A Woman of Genius by Mary Hunter Austen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Book 4, Chapter 9. There is very little more to write. I held myself together until I had written to Helmuth to say that I understood why he had done what he had done, and that I hoped he would be happy. The letter was not written to invite an answer. There was nothing he could say to please me that would not have been disloyal to Miss Stanley. Accordingly, no answer came, though it was a long time before I gave over the unconscious start at the sight of letters, the hope that somehow, against all reason, sometimes even yet. For I did not understand. I was married to him, much, much more married than I had ever been to Tommy Bettersworth, and it wasn't in me to understand how any man can take a woman as he had taken me, and not feel himself more bound than ever church and state could bind him. It was 10 months since I had seen him, but that while my body still ached with the memory of him, he could have given himself to another woman was an unbelievable offense. There are days yet when I do not believe it. There was nothing any of my friends could do for me. I had the sense to see that and did not trouble them. Sarah, who was the only one who might have comforted me out of her own experience, was all taken up with her husband's declining health. Mr. Lawrence died the next winter, and by that time my wound had got past the imperative need of speech. Effie was expecting another baby and wasn't to be thought of, so I turned at last, when the first sharp anguish was past, to Mark Eversley. He in all America stood for that high identification of his work with the source of power that it is the private study of all my days to reach. I repaired to him as did Christians of old to favored altars. That I did so return for comfort to that distributor of gifts by whose very mark on me I was set apart from the happier destiny, was evidence to me, the only evidence I could have at the time, that I had not been utterly mistaken in the choice I had made before I knew all that the choice involved. Eversley and his wife were Christian Scientists, and though they did not make me of their opinion, I owe them much in the way of practice and example that keeps me still within the circle of communicating fire. I re-established, never to be broken off again, practical intercourse with the friends of the soul of man. I learned to apply directly for the things I had supposed came only by loving, and I found that they came abundantly. I grew in time even to think of Helmuth without bitterness. What I was brought to see, over and above the wish to provide a home for his children, must have been at work in him, was much the same thing that had driven me to my work. The very need of me must have hurried him into the relief of being loved.
It was the only way which his purblind male instinct pointed him, to find an outlet for what goes from me over the footlights night by night. For a man, to be loved is of the greatest importance, but with women it is loving that is the fructifying act. That I was able to go on loving him was, I suppose, the reason why the shock I had sustained left no regrettable mark upon my career. The mark it left on me was none other than work is supposed to leave on every woman. What I am sure of now is that it is not work, but the loss of love that leaves her impoverished of feminine graces. I grew barren of manner and was reputed to be entirely absorbed in my profession. It was not, however, that I had excluded the more human interest, but they had taken flight. All the forces of my being had been, by the shock of loss, dropped into some subterranean pit, where they ran on underground and watered the choicest product of my art. If I had married Helmut Garrett, I might have grown insensible to him. As it was, I seemed to have been fixed, though by pain, in the fruitful relation. The loss of him, the desperate ache, the start of memory are just as good materials to build an artistic success upon as the joy of having. And I did build. I gathered up and wrought into the structure of my life the pain of loving as well as its delight. I am a successful actress. Whatever else has happened to me, I am at least a success. I never saw him again. I never saw Henry and Pauline Mills but once, and some bitterness in the occasion came near to driving me toward that pit into which Pauline was willing to believe I had already descended. It was the second season after I had parted from her in Chicago that some sort of brokers' convention had brought Henry on to New York and Pauline with him, and to the same hotel where Mark Eversley was shut up with an attack of bronchitis. Jerry and I, going up to call on him, came face to face with them. They were walking in the lobby. Pauline was in what for her was evening dress, her manner a little daunted, not quite carrying it off with the air of being established at the pivot of existence, which she could manage so well at Evanston. They were walking up and down, waiting, it seemed, for friends to join them, and they wheeled under the great chandelier just in time to come squarely across us. I could see Pauline clutch at her husband's arm, and the catch in her breath with which she jerked herself back from the impulse to nod, and looked deliberately away from me. For her, the evidence of my misdoing hung about me like an exhalation. She was afraid I should insist on speaking to her, and some of her friends would come up and see me doing it. I didn't, however, offer to speak to her. I looked instead at Henry. I stood still in my tracks and looked at him steadily and curiously. I wished very much to know what he meant to do about it. He turned slowly as I looked, from deep red to mottled purple, and very much against his will his head bowed to me. His body, to which Pauline clung, dared not move lest she detect it, but quite above and independent of his smooth-vested, self-indulgent front, his head bowed to me. So went out of my life 30 years of intimacy, which never succeeded in being intimate. But though one may excise 30 years of one's past without a tremor, one may not do it without a scar. To allay the irritation of Pauline's slight, I came near to being as abandoned as she believed, as I had moments of believing myself. For the possibility that Helmut Garrett had found in our relation of setting it aside made it at times of a cheapness which seemed to extend to me who had entertained it. I should have been happier, I thought, to have taken it lightly as he did. If so many women who had begun as I had begun had gone on repeating the particular instance, wasn't it because they found that that was the easiest, the only possible way to bear it? How else could one ease the pain of loving except by being loved again? And if I was to lose the Pauline Millses of the world by what had been entered upon so sincerely, Why then what more had I to risk on the light adventure? All this time I was sick with the need of being confirmed in my faith in myself as a person worthy to be loved, to feel sure that since my love had missed its mark, it wasn't I, at least, that had fallen short of it. It was that summer Jerry had been driven by some such need, I imagined, as I admitted in myself, to put his future in jeopardy by another marriage, which on the face of it offered even a more immediate occasion for shipwreck than the first, and I hadn't scrupled to put forth to save him. The new capacity to charm which had come upon me with the experience of not caring any more myself to be charmed. I knew it would have been a poor tribute to my skill as an actress if I hadn't by this time known the moves by which a man who is susceptible of being played upon at all can be drawn into a personal interest. And though I didn't then and do not now believe that a love serviceable for the uses of living together can be built up out of maid love, I was willing for the time to pit myself against the game that was played by Miss Chichester for Jerry's peace of mind. I played it all the better for not being, as the young lady was, personally involved in the stake. That I thought afterward of doing anything for myself with what I had got, when at last I had by this means brought Jerry down from Newport to my place on the Hudson for a week-end, was in part due to the extraordinary charm that Jerry displayed under the stimulus of a male interest in me, of whom for years he had thought of as being quite outside such consideration. There was a kind of wistfulness about Jerry when he was a little in love that made him irresistible. No doubt I was also a little warmed by the fire which I had blown up. He was to come from Saturday to Monday, and the moment I saw him getting down from the dog-cart I had sent to the station for him, I knew that I had only to let that interest take its course to find myself provided with a lover, whether or no I could command my heart to loving. I do not remember that I came to any conscious decision about it, but I know that I yielded myself to the growing sense of intimacy that I consciously drew, as one draws perfume from a flower, all that came to me from him. His new loveliness, touched still with the old solicitous sense of the preciousness of my gift. I dramatized to the full the possibility of what hung in the air between us. I dressed myself. I set the stage accordingly. It was Saturday evening after dinner that I sent him to the garden to smoke, keeping the house long enough to fix his attention on my joining him, by wondering what kept me, and so overdid my part by just so much as I made myself conscious of the taint of theatricality. For as I went down the veranda steps to meet him in the rose walk, the response of the actress in me to the perfectness of the setting and my fitness for the part of the great lady of romance drew up out of my past a faint reminder of myself going up another pair of stairs so many years ago in the figure of an orphaned child toiling through the world. Out of that memory there distilled presently a cold dew over my purpose. It was a perfect night. Warm emanations from the earth shut in the smell of the garden, and light airs from the river stirred the full-leafed trees. At the bottom of the lawn the soft full rush of the Hudson made a stir like the hurrying pulse. Beyond the silver gleam of its waters lay the farther bank strewn with primrose-colored lights, and above that the moon, low and full-orbed and golden. Its diffusing light mixed and mingled with the shadow of the moving boughs. I was wearing about my shoulders a light scarf that from time to time blew out with the wind, and as we paced in the garden strayed across Jerry's breast and was caught back by me, but not before on its communicating thread ran an electric spark. It must have been a good 2 hours after moonrise before we turned to go in, where the great hall lamp burned with a steady rose-red glow. At the foot of the veranda, a breeze sprang up fresher than before that caught my scarf from me and wrapped us both in it as in a warm, suffusing mood. We were so close that I had instinctively to put up my hand as a barricade against what was about to come from him to me, and as I did so I was aware of something that rose up from some subterranean crypt in me, that old romance of my mother's. Women like her, worlds of patient, overworking women who could do without happiness if only they found themselves doing right. Somehow they had laid on me the necessity of being true to the best I had known, because it was the best and had been founded in integrity and stayed on renunciations. I knew what I had come into the garden to do. I had planned for it. I thought myself prepared to take up, as many women of my profession did, the next best in place of the best which life had denied me, but my past was too strong for me. The unslumbering instinct that saves wild creatures before they are well awake had whipped me out of the soft entanglement, and before Jerry could grasp the change of mood in me, I was halfway up the stair. "This wind," I said, "I think it will blow up a rain before morning." I went on up before him. "You can see the river darkling below its surface. It does that before a change." I went on drawing the chairs back from the edge of the veranda. I called Elsa to fasten all the windows. When at last we came into the glow of the hall lamp, I could see his face, white yet with what he had missed. He thought he had blundered. He caught at my hand as I gave him his bedroom candle in an effort to recapture what had just trembled in the air between us. "Olivia." "I say, Olivia." "Your train leaves at 9:30, I reminded him. "I'll be up to pour your coffee." I went into my room and blew out my candle. The warm summer air came in between the white curtains. I knelt down beside my bed. An old habit, long discontinued. I was too much moved to pray, but I continued to kneel there a long time, listening to the soft shouldering of the maples against the wall outside the window. Far within me there was something which inarticulately knew that whatever the world might think of me, in spite of what I had confessed to Pauline, I was a good woman. I had loved Helmeth Garrett with the kind of love by which the world is saved. Past all loss and forsaking, past loneliness and longing, there was something which had stirred in me which would never waken to a lighter occasion. And whether great love like that is the best thing that can happen to us, or the most unusual, it had placed me forever beyond the reach of futility and cheapness. All this was several years ago. Jerry and I are the best of friends, and I am far too busy a woman to miss out of my life anything Pauline Mills could have contributed to it. Besides, I am very much taken up with my nieces and nephews. Forrester's oldest boy shows a creditable talent for the stage, and I have him at school here where I can watch him. I shall try him out on the road next summer. Effie's husband is in the legislature now, and Effie looks to see him governor. I am very fond of my sister. We grow together. I owe it to her to have found ways of making things easier for women who must tread my path of work and loneliness. It is partly at her suggestion that I have written this book, for Effie is very much of the opinion that the world would like to go right if somebody would only show it how. Sarah also added her word. It is the fact of your telling, whether they believe you or not, of your not being ashamed to tell, that is going to help them, she insists. At any rate, it will help other women to speak out what they think, unashamed. Most women are not thinking at all what they are very willing to be thought of as thinking. I am the more disposed to take their word for it, since as they are both happy, they cannot be supposed to have the fillip of discontent. Sarah left the stage a year after Mr. Lawrence's death to marry a banker from Troy, and she has never regretted it. She calls her oldest girl Olivia. It is the sane and sympathetic contact with the common destiny which I get at her house and my sister's that keeps me from the resort of successive and inconsequent passions, such as fill the void in the lives of too many women who are under the necessity of producing daily the materials of fire. But you must not understand me to blame women for taking that path when so many are closed to them. Haven't they been told immemorially that loving is their proper function, their only one? Last year I walked in a suffrage parade because Effie wrote me that it was my duty, and the swing of it, the banners flying, the proud music, set gates wide for me on fields of new, inspiring experience. All the paths that lead to the shining destiny. Why shouldn't women walk in them? I should think some of them might lead less frequently to bramble and morass. And after all, said Jerry, a day or two ago when I had read him some pages of my book, you have only told your own story. You haven't found out why all the rest of us run so afoul of personal disaster. We, I mean, who, as you say, nourish the world toward the larger expectation. And after all, said I, what is an artist but a specialist in human experience? And how can we find out how the world is made except by falling afoul of it? If when we fall we didn't pull the others down with us. I'm willing to learn, but why should others have to pay so heavily for my schooling? Where's the justice in making us so that we can't do without loving, and then not let us be happy in it? I don't believe it is the loving that is wrong. It is the other things that are tied up with it and taken for granted must go on with loving, that we can get on with. Marriage, you mean? Not exactly. Living in one place and by a particular pattern, thinking that because you are married you have to leave off this and take up that, which you wouldn't think of doing for any other reason. You mean? I know, he nodded. My wife was always wanting me to do this and that, on the ground that it was what married people ought, and I couldn't see where it led or why it was important. But what if it should turn out that the others are wrong and we are right about it? Oh, I think we are all wrong. People like us are after the truth of life, and marriage is the one thing that society won't take the trouble to learn the truth about. My baby, you know, I lost him because I didn't know how to take care of him, and there was nobody at hand who knew much more than I. But Effie's last baby came before its time, and they saved it by science, by knowing what and how. Why can't there be a right way like that about marriage, and somebody to discover it? Then where would we come in, after it was all found out, if we are the experimenters? Oh, there'd be other fields. Why shouldn't it be that when we have found out our relation to the physical world, we are finding it, you know, radioactivity and laws of falling bodies, go on finding out the law of our relations to one another. And when we found that out, then there's all the heavenly host. We'd have to find out how to get on with them. And in the meantime, we are spoiling a lot of people's lives because we can't get on with one another. He broke off suddenly. My wife is married again. I don't know if I told you. Ah, then you haven't quite spoiled her life. She has another chance. And the children? He had been very fond of them, I knew. I haven't done so much with my own life that I'd insist on controlling theirs. You've done wonders, I assured him. Jerry, honest, do you mind it so much, not having a wife and family? Oh, Lord, yes, Olivia. I need a wife the same as a man needs a watch to keep the time of life for me. He faced me with a swift, sharp scrutiny. Honest, do you mind? Sometimes, I admitted, when I think of what's coming, when I can't act any more. You'll be leading them all still when you are 70. You do better every season. He threw away his cigar and came and stood before me, preening his raven's wing, which now had a little streak of white in it. Olivia, What's the matter with you and me being married? We get on like everything." "There's more to it than that, Jerry." "Being in love, you mean? Well, I don't know that I would stick at a little thing like that." He was looking down at me with an effect of humor which I was glad to see covered a real anxiety about my answer. "I've been in love lots of times. I've been mad about several women. I don't feel that way about you, and I don't know that I care to. But if wanting you is loving, if worrying about you when you aren't quite up to yourself, and being proud of you when you are, if liking to be with you and wanting to read my manuscripts to you the minute I've written them, if owing you more than I owe any other woman and being glad to owe it, is loving you, why, I guess I love you enough for all practical purposes." What would Tottie Lockwood say? Or is it Dottie? Miss Lockwood was Jerry's latest interest at the Winter Garden. "Oh, she? She isn't in a position to say anything. It's only vanity on her part, and the lack of anything to do on mine. There'd be no time for totties if you married me." "Jerry, since you've asked me, I suppose you know that I... He put up an arresting hand. "I've guessed. There isn't anything you need to tell me, and I haven't an altogether clean record myself. But I want you to know, Olivia, that there was never anything in my case that you could take an exception to, so long as my wife was with me. I couldn't make her believe it, but it's true. Except, of course, that I was a fool. I hope I'm done with that." "I'd want you to be a bit foolish about me, Jerry. That is, if I make up my mind to it." I had to defend myself against the encouragement he got out of my admission. "But, Jerry, when did you begin to think about what you've just said?" "About marrying you? Ever since that time I went down to your place, when that Chichester girl—" "When I wouldn't take her place, appeasily merely? Well, suppose I had. Suppose I had been what the Chichester girl wouldn't. Would you still have wanted to marry me?" I would not admit to myself why I had asked that question. "I don't know, Olivia. Men, don't you know, not often. But I want to marry you now. I want it greatly." I held him off still, trying to get my own experience in shape where I could leave it behind me. Such affairs never turn out well, do they? "Hardly ever, I believe. Unless you turn them into marriage," I hazarded. "You know," he conjectured, "I've a notion that the kind of loving that goes to making such affairs can't be turned into marriage very easily. It's a kind of subconscious knowledge of their unfitness that keeps us from turning them into marriage in the first place. I wonder." He let me be for the moment, revolving many things in my mind. "It wouldn't be the vision and the dream, Jerry. You and I—" "Well, what of it? It might be something better, something neither of us ever had, really. It would be company." "No, I've never had it." I remembered how blank the issue of my work had been to Helmut Garrett. "Well, then, we have years of work in us yet. I'll buy Palakin out of the theater." He was going off at a tangent of what we might do together, but I had thought of something more pertinent. We might solve the problem of how to keep our art and still be happy. "We might." He was looking down on me with great content, but quite soberly. "Tell me, Olivia, suppose we shouldn't, even with the unhappiness, with all you have been through. Would you rather be what you are, or like the others?" We were silent as we thought back across the years together. There was very little by this time that we did not know of one another. "No," I said at last. "If being different meant being like the others, I'd not choose to have it any different." End of A Woman of Genius by Mary Hunter Austen.